Lost Islamic History audiobook by Firas-Alkhateeb, Chapter 6 Part 1. Upheaval. After the first 300 years of Islamic history, Muslims certainly could have believed that the ultimate triumph of Islam in the world was near. During that time, Islam spread rapidly throughout the Middle East, North Africa and Persia, with Muslim armies knocking on the door of France and India. When the military expansion stopped, the intellectual expansion began and the sciences were pushed into new frontiers never before seen. Even economically, the Muslims led the world, as Baghdad became the center of political and economic power, with banks that had branches as far away as China. Clearly, it would seem that Islam was destined to spread to every corner of the earth through armies, books and cons. Yet that destiny was not to be. The year 900 marks the beginning of a turbulent few hundred years for the Muslim world that would not truly end until the golden age of the Ottoman Empire in the 1500s. From the 10th to the 13th centuries, the Muslim world was under almost constant attack. The Shia, European Crusaders and Mongol hordes combined to rain terror upon the Islamic heartland, leading some to believe in the 1200s that the end of time was near. Not because of the triumph of Islam, but because of its destruction. Ismailism. Since its development, Shia has based itself around the idea of an alternative to the mainstream Sunni Caliphate. Leadership of the Muslim world belonged to the Imams, who had a special connection to God, they argued, not to any layperson who happens to belong to the Umayyad or Abbasid dynasties. When Shia itself was divided into numerous sects, differing ideas about how to bring about the imamate developed. The Twelvers, the largest group, seem to have preferred political inaction. In their view, since the 12th Imam went missing, no legitimate Muslim government could exist without him. For them, it was a patient waiting game until he returned to inaugurate a utopian civilization at the end of time. For the Seveners, however, such complacency would not do. They believed the seventh Imam, Ismail, had gone into hiding to avoid being caught by Abbasid authorities sometime in the mid-700s. Unlike the Twelvers, who believed no more Imams would come until the return of the last one. The Seveners believed Ismail's descendants continued to live in hiding among the mainstream Muslim population. Thus, they are more commonly referred to as Ismailis. The truth about Ismail's life, and even whether or not he ever existed, is lost somewhere in the realm of history and mythology. What is clear is that soon after his disappearance, missionaries began to travel throughout the Middle East and North Africa trying to build support for the Ismaili imamate. The Abbasids, who had come to power themselves through secret support networks, did everything they could to eradicate the threat the Ismailis posed. This only served to push the Ismaili movement further underground and away from Abbasid reach. The Ismaili missionaries spread throughout the major cities of the Muslim world and seem to have gathered support not based on their revolutionary ideas, but on any discontent people may have had with Abbasid authority. They were especially popular among the lower classes, non-Arabs who resented Arab rule, and the traditional Bedouins who had always hated central authority. After decades of missionary work, the Ismailis were ready to strike the first major blow against Sunni power right around the year 900. The Ismaili missionaries had managed to rouse up the Bedouin tribes of the eastern Arabian Peninsula to become a real threat to the Abbasids. Known as the Karmatians, this group of Ismailis struck unexpectedly into Syria in 903, when they captured Damascus and defeated an Abbasid army sent to conquer them. Their control of Syria was short-lived, however, and they were forced back into the Arabian desert just 2 years later. From 905 onwards, the Karmatians took to a new approach to bringing about an Ismaili revolution. Instead of seeking to conquer land and establish a new government, they resorted to terrorizing the Abbasids from their base in Bahrain in order to achieve their political goals. In 906, they massacred 20,000 people traveling to Mecca for the pilgrimage. In the mid-20s, the Iraqi cities of Basra and Kufa were sacked by the Karmatians, and even Baghdad itself came close to being captured by Bedouin raiders. Their sacrilegious attacks reached a peak in 928 when the Karmatians attacked Mecca, massacred its population, and stole the black stone from the Kaaba, moving it to Bahrain, where it would remain until 952. Religiously, the Karmatians were extremists who incorporated fanatical apocalyptic ideas as well as pre-Islamic religious beliefs into their worldview. Visitors to Bahrain relate that in the Karmatian domain, one could not find mosques or even people praying. The Karmatians rejected Mecca as a holy site and the pilgrimage as anti-Islamic, thus leading to their attacks on pilgrims and the city of Mecca. It is no surprise that traditionally Islamic orthodoxy has not even considered the Karmatians as Muslim. The differences in belief and action between the Karmatians and mainstream Islam is great, to say the least. But despite their reign of terror, the Karmatians never became a real threat to the established order. Their methods were too extreme to be accepted by the Muslim world and their beliefs too unorthodox. The real threat to Sunni Islam instead came from the Maghreb, where another Ismaili movement rose on the backs of the Berbers to become a regional power. The Fatimids. Ismaili missionaries were relatively successful in North Africa, where they could exploit traditional tensions between the Berbers of the Sahara and the Arabs of the coastal cities to their advantage. Throughout the late 800s, Ismaili missionaries built up support among the Samhaja Berbers, leading to the violent overthrow of the ruling Sunni dynasties of North Africa, the Rustamids and the Aghlabids, by 908. In 909, this group of Ismailis declared the reappearance of an imam descended from Ismail. He was Ubayd Allah, but he took the honorific title Al-Mahdi, meaning the guided one or savior. Ubayd Allah's origins are obscure. He claimed descent from Ismail, and thus also from Ali and his wife Fatima, leading to the name of the dynasty he inaugurated, the Fatimids. In 929, the Umayyad ruler of Iberia declared the establishment of a new caliphate based in Cordoba to combat the Fatimids in North Africa. In the 900s, there were thus three dynasties claiming the caliphate: the Abbasids, the Fatimids, and the Umayyads. The Fatimids would not be content with being a thorn in the side of the Sunni world like the Karmatians. They believed it was their duty to entirely take it over and establish Ismaili rule through Ubayd Allah. He was thus declared caliph in 909, directly challenging the Abbasids for authority over the Muslim world. Although the Fatimids were not the first ones to declare their opposition to the Abbasids, they soon became the most dangerous. From their base in modern Tunisia, they fanned out quickly, conquering Sicily, moving eastward towards Egypt, and bringing western North Africa under their control by the 920s. After the death of Ubayd Allah in 934, the Fatimids slowed their military expansion. Numerous rebellions arose led by Muslims discontent with the unorthodox Ismailis and their views for a Sunni-free world. Even the Kharijis of North Africa rebelled against Fatimid authority. The rebellions failed to bring an end to the Fatimids, although they slowed the Ismaili advance through the rest of the Muslim world for a few decades. But Sunni disunity proved to be too big of a handicap to permanently stop the growth of the Fatimid realm. By the mid-10th century, the Abbasid Caliphate became essentially powerless. Throughout the 9th and 10th centuries, political decentralization coupled with the rise of hereditary governorships led by slave soldiers brought in from Turkic lands led to the decline of the caliph's power. In 945, the Persian dynasty conquered Iraq and ruled in the caliph's name. Egypt, once an economic and agricultural center of the caliphate, was under an independent Turkish dynasty known as the Ikshidids that was constantly quarreling with an Arab state based in northern Syria. To say the Muslim world between Egypt and Persia was disunited is an understatement. Constant warfare among Muslims and a renewed Byzantine threat from the north gave the Fatimids an opportunity to invade Egypt in 969. The Fatimids led an army of around 100,000 soldiers against the Ikhshidids of Egypt, who were quickly defeated. Sunni governance in Egypt collapsed in the face of the marauding Fatimid armies. The victorious Fatimids established a new city, Al-Qahira, Cairo, along the banks of the Nile as their capital. No longer a desert nuisance, the Fatimids were now the most powerful state in the Muslim world. With chaos reigning in Syria, Iraq, and Persia, it seemed conceivable that the Fatimids would continue their eastward march into Baghdad, overthrow the caliphate, and establish themselves as rulers of the entire Muslim world. This was not to be, however, as the Fatimids soon had to deal with Byzantine threats to Syria and, ironically, attack from their co-religionists, the Karmatians of Bahrain, who considered the Fatimids not extreme enough in their Ismaili beliefs. The capital of the caliphate thus escaped conquest by the unorthodox Fatimids, and the Sunni world had time to recover and build strong political and military institutions under the Seljuk Turks in the 11th century. The Fatimids thus had to make do with North Africa, Egypt, the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, and parts of Syria and Palestine. Their revolutionary zeal continued, with their desire to turn their domain into a purely Ismaili Shia land. Al-Azhar University was established in Cairo in 970 in an effort to spread Ismaili beliefs among the mainly Sunni population of Egypt. Sunni Muslims, Christians, and Jews underwent periods of intense persecution as well as periods of relative freedom under the Fatimids, based on the whims of whichever caliph was in charge. One of the most interesting attempts to bring Ismailism to the masses was from 996 to 1021 during the reign of the Fatimid Caliph Al-Hakim, infamously known as the Mad Caliph. Like all Fatimid rulers, he was hailed as a divinely chosen and holy leader by Ismailis, but by pretty much all others, he was hated as a tyrant, ruling based on whims and desire. Christians and Jews suffered as he ordered the destruction of churches and synagogues throughout his domain, including the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, where Christians believe Jesus was buried and resurrected. Assurances for the safety of the church made by Umar in 637 were ignored, and the site was entirely demolished in 1009. Christians were not the only ones oppressed by Al-Hakim. Muslims were banned from performing communal prayers according to the norms of Sunni Islam, and the Fatimid Caliph's name was inserted into Friday prayers, giving them an Ismaili leaning. Sunnis were banned from entering the holy city of Jerusalem, along with Christians and Jews. Al-Hakim's irrationally oppressive laws were not restricted to religion. On a whim, all the dogs of a village near his palace in Cairo were killed because their barking annoyed the caliph. He decreed all business must be conducted at night. Chess was banned, presumably because he was not good at it, and the consumption of mulukia, corcorus leaves, a staple Egyptian food, was outlawed. He even placed the great Muslim physicist Ibn al-Haytham under house arrest because he failed to build a dam across the Nile. To the relief of many of his subjects, the reign of the Mad Caliph ended one night in 1021, when he ventured out into the desert alone and mysteriously disappeared. Al-Hakim's time in power was unique for its brutality and oppression. Society under the Fatimids cannot be easily generalized as either tolerant or oppressive. The Fatimids suffered from a lack of concrete legal guidelines that dictated governance, society and relations with non-Muslims. In contrast to the Abbasids and other Sunni dynasties, which were bound by Islamic laws, the Fatimid caliphs, as semi-divine beings, were allowed to exercise a much more personal form of authority. Thus, each new caliph could radically change the character and direction of the empire, sometimes with disastrous results. Without a strong legal and intellectual basis, the Fatimids and their faith never became particularly attractive to their subjects. And Ismailism was relegated to the political elite as the population of Egypt, Syria and North Africa remained staunchly Sunni Muslim. Without widespread support, and hampered by radical changes in policy during each succession, the Fatimids slowly declined in power through the 11th and 12th centuries. They were finally eliminated by Salah al-Din during the Crusades, another conflict which wreaked havoc on the Muslim world. The Crusades. Perhaps no other conflict in Western and Islamic history has been as emotionally charged as the Crusades. The entire conflict itself was based around the city of Jerusalem, holy to Jews, Christians and Muslims alike. For Christians, it is the city where Jesus preached, was crucified and resurrected. For Muslims, its holiness stems from the belief that Muhammad miraculously traveled from Mecca to Jerusalem in one night and then from Jerusalem to heaven to speak to God. During the Crusades, the memories of these events were evoked thousands of times by kings, sultans, generals, priests and imams to rally the faithful on both sides to stake their claim to the holy city. Starting in 1095, 200 years of conflict commenced that would fundamentally reshape Christian Europe as well as the Muslim world for good. The impetus for the Crusades began far from Jerusalem in Central Asia. Here, the Turks had lived for thousands of years as a tribal, nomadic people who were feared for their battle toughness. The Abbasids put the Turkic expertise in warfare to good use by recruiting generals from Central Asia to serve in their militaries as early as the 9th century. Mass migrations of Turks soon followed as tribes moved out of Central Asia and into the Islamic world. As they migrated, the Turkic tribes adopted Islam and began to set up their own states in the political chaos of the 10th century. The greatest of these was the Great Seljuk Empire, established in 1037. The Seljuks built a stable state that stretched from Syria to Central Asia. The era of Abbasid power was by this point nothing more than a memory, but the Seljuks assumed a role as protectors of the caliphs, who remained entrenched in their palaces in Baghdad. As staunchly Sunni Muslims, the Seljuks even managed to provide a counterweight to the heretical Fatimids and helped prevent Fatimid expansion in the 11th century. The Seljuks established the Nizamiya school in Baghdad in the late 11th century. It was the largest university of the Middle Ages and charged no tuition. In 1071, the Seljuks won an important battle against the Byzantine Empire in eastern Anatolia. The Battle of Manzikert effectively ended the ability of the Byzantines to hold on to Anatolia as a complete unit. In the years following the battle, the Seljuks gradually expanded westward throughout the peninsula until they began to appear on the shores opposite Constantinople, threatening to expand Turkic Muslim power into the imperial city and beyond. In 1095, the Byzantine Emperor Alexios realized the Byzantine could not battle the Turks alone. Despite a rivalry between the eastern and western halves of Christianity that spanned centuries, Alexios wagered that Christian unity was the only thing that could prevent the fall of the Byzantine Empire. He sent an urgent appeal to Pope Urban II in Rome for assistance, perhaps hoping for an expeditionary force that could help him turn the tide and regain the lands lost since Manzikert. Urban took the opportunity to rally a pan-European Christian army in the name of Christ that numbered in the tens of thousands. But he had no intention of helping Alexios, or even fighting the Turks. Urban's crusade set its sights on Jerusalem. Decrying the fact that Jerusalem had been in Muslim hands since Umar's caliphate, Urban called on all Christians to support an expedition to conquer the city and establish a Latin Christian kingdom in Palestine under the authority of the papacy. Urban's army was slow to mobilize. It was not until 1096 and 1097 that armies led by nobles and knights began marching towards Eastern Europe from modern-day France, Germany and Italy. Along the way, European Jews were massacred in huge numbers due to the religious zeal stoked by the church. The first crusade was so fearsome that when it arrived at the walls of Constantinople, Emperor Alexios refused to allow them entry into the city, for fear that they would plunder it as they did with dozens of cities and towns along the way. The 30,000-strong army crossed the Bosphorus and began a long march through Anatolia that the newly established Turks were unable to resist. In late 1097, the Crusaders reached Antioch, a well-defended, major city that today lies near the border of Turkey and Syria. This was to be the first test of the Crusades. If the Christians were successful here, they could expect to continue their march towards Jerusalem. If they failed, it could be harder to recruit future armies to venture far into the Muslim world to conquer Jerusalem. The siege of Antioch reveals much about the political situation of the Middle East late in the 11th century. The city was incredibly well defended and posed a considerable challenge to the invaders. But politically, the city was an island. The Great Seljuk Empire had disintegrated in the years leading up to the Crusades. No longer was it one united political entity. Instead, petty Turkic emirs administered individual cities and seemed to be constantly quarreling. The major cities of Syria, Damascus, Aleppo, Antioch, and Mosul were all disunited, and their emirs had all been in perpetual war throughout the 1090s. When the ruler of Antioch, Yagisian, asked for help from his Turkic brethren against the crusaders that surrounded his city, he received no response. The other emirs were probably happy to see their rival being attacked, as his demise would mean their increased power and influence. As such, Antioch received no help from the surrounding Muslim cities. Furthermore, an armor maker that was in charge of the defense of a section of the city's walls ended up allowing the Crusaders' entry into the city because of a personal feud he had with the emir. Once the Crusaders captured the city, its population was put to the sword. The massacre of Antioch and other cities along the way to Jerusalem instilled terror in the surrounding areas. Muslim emirs were keen to avoid conflict with the Crusaders, and once they realized the target was Jerusalem, many decided to support the Crusaders with food, arms, and safe passage rather than to fight them. By the summer of 1099, the Crusaders finally reached the walls of Jerusalem. Jerusalem was in no position to defend itself. In the years before, it had gone back and forth between Fatimid and Seljuk control, and its defenses were in shambles. Furthermore, the Fatimids were slow to recognize the threat the Crusaders posed to Jerusalem, and there was nothing more than a token garrison in the city. Certainly not enough to withstand a siege against tens of thousands. The Fatimids mobilized an army in Egypt to go defend the city. But by the time they reached Palestine, it was too late. On 15th July 1099, after a siege lasting only a week, the Crusaders managed to push into the city and take it from the Muslims. For the first time since Umar entered the city 462 years before, Jerusalem came under Christian control. In the temple and porch of Solomon, men rode in blood up to their knees and bridal reins. Raymond the Aguilars, a crusader, referring to the conquest of Jerusalem in 1099. For the Islamic world, the conquest of Jerusalem was a disaster. Its entire civilian population, over 70,000 people, was massacred. In the Al-Aqsa Mosque, where Muslims believe Muhammad led all previous prophets in prayer, the blood of Muslim civilians was up to the shins of the conquerors. Mosques and synagogues throughout the city were destroyed. Even Christians suffered as the Crusaders sought to impose their own Catholic version of Christianity instead of the traditional Greek, Georgian, Armenian, and other churches that had operated in the city. The news of the loss of Islam's third holiest city was a shock to Muslims around the world. Expressions of anger and vengeance raged in Cairo and Baghdad. Yet the expected unified Muslim front in the face of Crusader atrocities never came. The Fatimids were defeated in battle on the coast of Palestine, and, after that, they did not make much of an effort to liberate the city. Court intrigue and ineffective leaders rendered the Fatimids entirely incapable of dealing with the Crusaders. Meanwhile, the Abbasid Caliphate was still powerless, and the Turkic emirs in Syria, Iraq, and Persia remained in a state of constant civil war. With the Muslim world preoccupied, the Crusaders consolidated their position along the coast of Palestine and Syria. More cities were conquered, and within a few years, 4 Crusader kingdoms ruled the Mediterranean coast. In the new Middle East of the early 1100s, East and West began to mix in the Holy Land for the first time since the arrival of Islam. The Frankish knights who conquered the region began to establish European-style feudal societies, like the ones in medieval Europe. While the Crusader armies had depopulated the city, the surrounding villages were mostly left unharmed and were simply made property of European knights. The Crusades did not usher in new demographics to the Muslim world. No mass migration of European peasants came into the Holy Land. Rather, the existing Arab Muslim demographic was incorporated into a European-style feudal society. This became one of the entry points for Muslim knowledge in Europe, as more enlightened Crusaders took home knowledge of the sciences and philosophy that they were exposed to in the Levant. Economically, the Crusades marked the beginning of new ties between the East and West. The most enterprising sailors of medieval Europe were the Italian city-states. As the first Crusaders marched down the shore of Syria in the late 1090s towards Jerusalem, Italian merchant ships shadowed them in the Mediterranean. Once the Crusader kingdoms were established and consolidated, Italian states such as Genoa and Venice regularly sent fleets of merchants to the Holy Land. Trade in goods that were once distant and unreachable now became commonplace. The result was a huge influx of wealth into the Italian peninsula and the hands of the leading trading families of the major city-states. That wealth, coupled with knowledge gained from translations of Muslim scholarly works, would later help fuel the Renaissance starting in the 14th century. Furthermore, the wealth and power gained by the city-states made them formidable opponents to the Ottoman Empire in the 15th and 16th centuries.